degree MBT upper central with a wire bend, or whether you're trying to move a 12 degree central or an 8 degree central, you can see how all the bends change and are very different. You know, the thing that was with Ultima when Dr. Damon developed it, that building the first true full expression appliance, there really only could be one prescription. Because if this wire and this bracket on each of these teeth individually is going to orient them in the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis, and that's all we're talking about is three-dimensionally orienting objects in space. We, in this profession, call it torque, rotation, and angulation, but it's just x, y, z. We know what the x, y, z is of every one of these teeth. We know what the angulation should be. We know how much rotation control we need, and we know what the torque should be. Now the question is, can you build a wire, made it with a bracket, to deliver each of those three axes on these teeth independently? Because we know the wire is going to get back to this final shape. And if we know that, and we know what the prescription is, we should be able to accomplish that with engineering, sound manufacturing, and Dr. Damon's new parallelogram slot and combi wire. So XYZ, really, you know, the rotation, the angulation, and the torque. How do you develop a system that is going to deliver the rotation, the angulation, and the torque without bending wire? Everything that he's shown today, he showed that the rotations are going to come out in the 14275 wire. You're going to get your transverse development and you're going to get your rotations out. When you get to the 18275 wire, you're going to get a full interaction with the wire and the bracket that is going to correct angulation and rotation, angulation and torque, while maintaining rotation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work with the puzzle pieces and go through, that's what I'm calling them, puzzle pieces. I'm going to go through an explanation of that, and we're going to move from 1x parts in some cases, which is the real size of the part, 1x. We'll move to 15x parts, which are 15 times the size of the real bracket. And then what we'll do is we will move to 150x parts, which is basically just the box. And when we look at this just like a box, that's kind of really what we're doing at a really high level, is orienting boxes in space. And if you can orient this box in space, then whatever you attach to it is going to be oriented correctly. So if I have a tooth attached to this box, and if I completely fill the box, then I know that I have full control of that tooth, and it can only land up in one spot. Filling the box, though, is, you know, it was kind of what created all of the problems. Because back in the day, when there were three-walled systems and not four-walled systems, people would go through their wire progressions. And when Larry Andrews came up with 7 degrees being the correct number for the upper central, Dr. Damon explained to us how he did that. And the way that he did that was by measuring all of the orthodontic normals that were sitting on the table. He measured that facial inclination to be at 7 degrees. He knew that when he kicked it up on the average occlusal plane, 7 or 8, that you would have that facial surface of that central parallel to the perpendicular off of Frankfurt, and the patient's profile would look beautiful, and the tooth didn't look flared or retroclined. And so that was what Larry Andrews, his prescription did, was measure the final facial inclinations and angulations of all the teeth. And he did create a straight wire appliance if you were able to completely fill the slot. But nobody was able to completely fill the slot because the wire became too stiff. You know, it wasn't biologically sensible like everything Dr. Damon speaks of. And you couldn't get the wire in because it would be too challenging with the minor vertical changes of the brackets based on the positioning. To get the wire in would be difficult. So the industry kind of said, well, it all just seemed to settle on one wire being sort of the finishing wire. And that finishing wire sort of became a 19 vertical dimension wire in an 022 vertical dimension slot, is fairly much the standard. Now, there was such a big pushback in this day to the importance of driving the wire to the base of the slot. The base of the slot was sort of the only section of the bracket that really mattered to people. It was always about getting the wire to the base. And if you wanted to express your torque, your 7 degrees, then what you'd have to do is, you know, put on maybe a steel ligature tie and crank, and try to drive to the base of the slot. When you did that, you know, you might get your rotation corrected, you might express your torque, but more than likely you crank to the base of the slot, created an enormous amount of discomfort for the patient in a stainless steel wire, and then the ligature tie would relax over time, and that whole concept of people going to the orthodontist to get their braces tightened, you know, because that's what people were doing, was trying to drive to the base of the slot. But, you know, so what happens then, elastomeric ligatures come in because nobody likes doing steel ties. And the elastomeric ligatures were something that were demanded by the patient more than the doctor, because the steel ties were better clinically than the elastomeric ligatures. You could almost create a passive situation with a steel tie if you wanted, but there was no control, chair to chair or staff member to staff member, how much they were cranking the wire to the base of the slot and how much friction and binding there were. The variability was enormous. But elastomeric ligatures became popular, and then away we went. And then you have companies that come in and say, well, you know, why don't we just build a wall on the bracket that has a spring mechanism, and, you know, they're called active clips. And, you know, there's a lot of active clip brackets out there. What's interesting about active clip brackets is that when you study them, they don't have the force to drive the wire to the base of the slot. And so if you have a torque imperfection, let's say, the idea that this spring clip is going to push this wire to the base of the slot and change the torque of the tooth, that's a myth. It's not a reality. It doesn't happen. And so all that you're doing then is sort of taking a system that is just a 3-walled system with everybody focusing on the base wall. You've got variability in not having a 3rd wall. So there's rotational freedom that can exist. But then you put a spring clip that might not be able to control rotation really either, and it can't drive the wire to the base of the slot. Now, even if it could, we have to question if we would want it to, when you think that most of the prescriptions in the world, you know, that are in twin appliances are MBT. If we put on a 17-degree central of an MBT bracket, and let's just assume that the wire, the spring clip, or the elastomeric ligature could drive the wire to the base of the slot, you're going to fully express 17. But who wants 17? What you wanted was 7. And 17 would be 10 degrees flared. So the point that I'm making is that there's so many things that have been handed down over time, and so many beliefs that we need to sort of revisit. Is the base of the slot really king? Is, you know, why is there 5 different prescriptions for an upper central? and all of these systems suggesting that you can express it. You know, I give credit to McLaughlin, Bennett, and Trevisi. Their whole idea was that, you know, the reason that you have 17 degrees on the central is because if you're running retractive mechanics or space closing mechanics, then what'll happen is it'll rotate until you hit a couple, and there's a couple there. And if you lost 10 degrees of torque here, then that 17 becomes 7. So wonderful, and that makes perfect sense, and very good work. And but the part that is sort of the untold story is that orthodontic manufacturers have a very difficult time building really high tolerances in their brackets. It's very expensive to do, and very expensive to maintain these tolerances with metal injection molding as it is. I won't go into the complexities of that, but when we think whether or not we have a 022 vertical slot, it's not. Thank you. And when we think that we have a wire that is 19 in vertical dimension, it's maybe it is, maybe it isn't. There's a tolerance. There's a range of play. So everything that you see published in catalogs, they're called in engineering terms nominals. So that is what the company wants it to be, or, you know, that's their nominal value, 1925. But if you measure the tolerances, it might be 18.5 to 19.5. And if you measure an 022 slot, it might be 023 or 025. And you know, it didn't really matter that much in the past because everybody had to bend wire to get finished anyways. So the difference was if it got you 70% of the way there, are you having to make a 5-degree bend or an 8-degree bend? You're going to make a bend, but the problem is you don't know how big the bend needs to be. And that's why sometimes when, you know, people that are using, you know, twin appliances or even, you know, PSL and neutral brackets in the past, you know, you go in and you'd see that central looks like it needs about this much torque. And the fact that all of you control your wires, control the insertions, control the bends. We've talked about this, you know, Dr. Damon and Dr. Bicknell and I. This is our favorite audience to speak to. And the reason is because you are actually having your hands on the system and you feel what the wires are doing when you're inserting them. You feel if the bend isn't big enough, or if the bend is too large. In North America, they put a bend in the wire, they hand it to the assistant, and then the assistant goes to put it in, and then when the patient's eyes bulge out of their head, they think maybe that's a little bit too much, or they can't get it in, or then they have to come and adjust it a bit, take another little bit of a guess. The reason I'm so excited about everyone in this room using Ultima is because you're going to feel in a very tactile way whether or not everything that we're saying is true or not. You know, when you insert a wire into a tooth that has a slight rotation, for the first time you're going to push that wire in and you're going to go, holy, I have to deflect this wire to get it into that slightly rotated tooth. And you're going to say, wow, this is fantastic because I see a one-to-one relationship between what the wire is going to do and what I want the tooth to do. And when you go ahead and you put the wire in and you're looking for a little more torque, proclination torque, the wire's not just going to go straight in. You're going to have to deflect the wire a little bit to get it in. And you're going to go, great, this system is going to do what it's supposed to do. So to finish off the tolerance part of it, I'll do a little demonstration with this Typodon. And this Typodon, again, is from a very reputable company and a bunch of wonderful doctors that created a prescription that, you know, became probably the most widely used prescription. But this demonstration I'm doing is just to really make the point about tolerances and in wires and brackets. Because as you go back and you're lecturing and you're sharing information with people, you know, it's one thing that they don't really know or understand is that. And the doctors that built these prescriptions quite often didn't understand that either. Because the number one question that should be asked is, if you have a 17-degree central, is, what wire is the wire that fully expresses the 17? If when somebody gives a prescription value, it means absolutely nothing if you don't know what the vertical dimension of the wire is and the corner radius of the wire, and it's just a number. If we look at MBT and we take these 17 and the 10, I got these brackets from a doctor friend of mine, and he lives down the street, and he knows that I do this presentation, Dr. Phil. But if we look at the 1925 wire on this lateral, and I can move the lateral in either direction 12 degrees until it hits the couple, it binds inside of that slot. I can do the same thing on this one. I can move it 12 degrees in either direction. What's interesting, again, is when you do have a torque issue, quite often it's misdiagnosed as a vertical issue. Those aren't vertical issues. Those are actually torque issues. And these are not in-out issues. These are actually torque issues as well. And forever, people have been masking torque problems with vertical and in-out step bends instead of just correcting the torque. But to get to my point, look at these teeth. They don't move. And I go, well, why do I have the 12 degrees of play in either direction here, and I have no play in these teeth? And then I thought, wow, there really probably is only one reason for that. I'll bet these are 018 brackets that the doctor might have ordered the wrong brackets, or the sales rep did. And boy, I hope Dr. Phil didn't bond up 50 cases and he's only going to find out later. I called Dr. Phil and I said, you might want to go and check. I think we have a problem. Go and check your bracket inventory and let me know if what the vertical dimension of your slots are on your centrals. And he said, oh my gosh, they're 18. Thank you for telling me. I've got 18 vertical dimension slots. And oh, thank you. I'll have to go and check and figure out when this problem arose. And I said to him, well, that's one problem, Dr. Phil, but there's a secondary problem. And he said, well, what is that? And I said, help me understand how a 19 vertical dimension wire fits in an 018 slot. So that point is something when people look at buying brackets from manufacturing companies for lower costs, the tolerances are all over the place. And on the wires, the tolerances are all over the place. And when you stack the wire with the bracket, and there's a word for you, it's an engineering word, stack, those are called stacking tolerances. A small wire and a big bracket, that's a stack. Now you can kind of see where I'm going with it. So for us to manufacture Dr. Damon's brainchild, we really, as a company, needed to focus so heavily on our ability to manufacture and control all of those things, which we did. And I have a whole presentation I can do on that, but we're not going to do that today. But we're happy to prove that as well. So aside from manufacturing tolerances and variances, I'm going to go through some puzzle piece exercises, and we're going to start with, this is kind of a new thing that's kind of fun. If you look at this hockey puck, some of you may or may not know it. I'm from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And my Calgary Flames just got knocked out of the playoffs, which is very disappointing. But here's one of my hockey pucks, and if you see the nuts on here, I know all of us in one time of our lives have grabbed wrenches and gone to tighten something, and we always go, oh, I think that's about 12 millimeter, 14. I think that's about. And then you run to the workshop, and then you go and you dig around in all the messy piles of junk that's in the drawer, and you'll end up finding one that you think is close. And then what happens is you run back and you put it on the nut, and you go, oh, that is it's not the right wrench. but it might work. But what might happen also is I might push on it and try to turn the nut, and then I'm going to round off the edges of the nut and wrap my hand on the manifold of the car or whatever. But I know all of us have kind of tried that. What's interesting, if you look closely here and you look at this angle, that angle from here to here and up to there, that angle is about 12 degrees. And so let's just remember that angle for a second. And while we're doing that, we're going to talk about something else called couples. Couples are, 2 points of contact equal in magnitude and opposite in direction, rotating around a center point. So that's a couple. I've hit a couple on this side, and then I've hit a couple on this side, though I'm quite far away from the couple. I'm like 12 degrees of freedom, clearance before I hit the couple. Something like this might be a lot better, where I have very little clearance, and I have the right tool for the job, and I have control of that nut. So that's a transferable concept that will come into play as we move through this presentation. But if we look at these situations, this is kind of what we're dealing with in orthodontics. We've got the wrong wrench, and if I look at the wrench and throw the tooth on there, I've got too much play before I hit a couple in the rotation perspective. I've got the same thing when I go ahead and I look at it from an angulation perspective. I've got too much play before I hit the couple. And then it's the same thing from a third order perspective. We put this on and then I've got too much play before I hit the couple. So what Dr. Damon did was figure out how to reduce the amount of clearance between the wire and the bracket and get the desired level of control that people need. Now, when we go ahead and look at moving boxes, which I've talked about, all that we're really doing in orthodontics is orienting boxes in space. And with a passive self-ligating four-walled system, no wall is more important than any of the others. Dr. Damon talked about how the whole system is built around center point. And so we don't think that this base wall is more important than this face wall, or we don't think this wall is more important than this wall. Each of these four walls are of equal importance in giving you this three-axis control. And that's what I'm going to explain as I move forward here. So right now, if we were to take an example and say, well, maybe we'll make it a 17-degree central. We'll, just for fun, make it an MBT central. We know that the central, we want to orient it in space. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a lateral. And maybe we'll do a Larry Andrews lateral for this demonstration. So we've got 3 degrees on the lateral, according to Larry Andrews. And the reason I'll do the lateral is because we probably have this, firmly in our mind. Because how many times do we have laterals that are blocked out lingually? And when you put the wire in and you try to draw them into position, they'll end up being flared. It's a very common thing we have to deal with. Thank you. And so let's look at that example where people using passive self-ligation or people using twin appliances or people using active brackets. This transcends across everything. It's not really all a PSL discussion. But for us, we've got the fourth wall, and let's say that the lateral is in a lingual position, and when you drag the box forward into position, that's all it's doing is dragging it. It's just tipping it forward, and then maybe you put in an 0 and 8 wire, and it drags the box a little bit further. And then you say, okay, well, let's put in our 1425 wire. And I'm going to the AAO in Philadelphia in a couple of days here, and the comment that I hear routinely and have for decades is doctors say that I like to get into rectangular wires early so that I can start expressing torque. And through studying Dr. Damon's work and doing these exercises of study, you know, what became a harsh realization is that if people were finishing in 1925 wires, even 1925 wires, which is the finishing wire, they were probably never controlling torque. And so when people say I like to get into rectangular wires early to start controlling torque, and maybe this first wire is the 14, I mean, if we take this like driving a car into the garage, you open the door, drive the car into the garage, but you know, we talked about couples. Is this wire coupled in any way with these two walls? No, it's not touching either of them. So it's not going to do anything to the facial inclination of that tooth. The wire's just going to drag the box a little bit further. And so now we're sitting in this position. And so we've gone 014, 018, we've got to a 1425 wire, and we're hoping that the wire is going to take out the rotations, but we've got clearance here between these two walls, and this wall are responsible for rotation, and this wall and this wall are responsible for torque and angulation. So that 1425 wire, all that it didn't do anything different than a round wire would have, because it just contacted the face of the bracket somewhere and just dragged it a little bit further. But now we say, okay, well, let's get the patient back in 8 weeks later, or I don't know how many appointment intervals, hoping that this had worked a bunch of magic, and say, well, let's put in the 1825 wire. And so you open the door and you drive the car into the garage, but once again, what happened there? No change, because I'm not coupled up here and I'm still not coupled back here. The 25 dimension didn't change. Vertical dimension changed, but not enough to engage a couple here to correct this. So then it was like, okay, well, wow, let's go to the finishing wire. And maybe this wire was left in the patient's mouth for a couple intervals, arguably not doing very much at all. Let's put in a finishing wire, a 1925 wire, and then what happens is you open the car, drive your car into the garage, and what happened? Nothing. Now, this is interesting, and when I talked about the fact that you get to put your hands and put the wires in and get to feel everything, in some parts of the world where the doctors barely ever touch the patients and the assistants put in all of the wires, the assistants love doing this, because you know how easy the wire change is from the 14 to the 18 to the 19? It just goes right in, and that's not good, you know? But so sometimes when we introduce Ultima into offices, you know, the assistants say, well, we don't know if we really like it because the wires are a little harder to get in. It's like, well, that means it's working. That's probably a good thing. But I won't have any of you calling me saying the wires are a little harder to get in. You will be so happy that they are. Yes, because it's about having to deflect the wire, which initiates energy, and then the wire wants to get back to its passive state and relax, and the tooth needs to come along with it. So let's look at, you know, how Dr. Damon solved for the first problem. And the first problem that he wanted to solve for when he built the combi wire, which, you know, we've seen that 18275 wire, you know, and the first thing that he did, you know, wanted to solve for was he built the wire first. He built it from the center point of the wire outwards. He knew that he had to increase the horizontal dimension of the wire so that he could make contact with the vertical walls, create a couple that would give you the rotation control that you needed. So we did exhaustive studies to figure out how much control do you need? And what we did was we did these visual analog surveys where we asked people, you know, if they could see a rotation to the degree that they would either do a cheating reposition mesial distal or a bend to correct for it. And when people had a tooth that was rotated 5 degrees, everybody said, yes, I would fix that. 4 degrees, yes, I would fix that. 3 degrees, half the people said, that's pretty good. 2 degrees, most everybody had their hand up. Now, we engineered Ultima to 1 degree, and we know what the stacking tolerances are. So it's not 1 degree, but it's like 0.8 to 1.2, and it's well under 2. But to make its rotation control any greater than that is law of diminishing returns, because it's not visually discernible. And also all it does is increase friction and binding. And you don't want friction and binding, you know, coming out of a 14275 wire. When you get the rotations resolved, you want to be able to close space efficiently without binding from rotation, angulation, or torque. So Dr. Damon built the wire 0275, but then built the bracket slot 028. And we know what the clearance is between the horizontal dimension of the wire and these vertical walls of the bracket. 0275 to 028, 5 thou. What does 5 thou offer in terms of rotation control? 1 degree. Will you all be happy with 1 degree? Yes. Will the patient be happy? Yes. Nice thing is once you get it, you never lose it. How many times did you have anterior alignment that looked pretty good, and then you started to close space with your chains, and maybe you were in a 1825 wire or something, but you've got all of this clearance between the horizontal dimension of the wire and the bracket, and then that compressive force of the chain, you know, when left on over too long, like Dr. Damon talked about, when the spaces are closed, get it off. But people historically left it on forever, and then you would slip a contact, and the patient would come back mid-treatment and be more dissatisfied than they were the time that they were there before. And then I think quite often it's like, oh, that happens all the time, don't worry, we'll fix it at the end, you know, is kind of the discussion. The neat thing about Ultima is once you get your rotations corrected and they're out, coming out of the 14275 wire with a very simple bracket placement, dead center on the tooth, mesial distally, no more cheating a little bit mesial or a little bit distal. All cheating brackets mesial distally, all that was an effort to try to reduce the play that never should have been there to begin with. And so the nice thing about Ultima is when the rotations are out and you get beautiful transverse development, because when the transverse development is happening, really there's one point of this wire that's contacting the face of the slide. And if this is a bicuspid, let's say, it's just pushing the bicuspid out, and there's very little binding or friction that exists here. But once it gets that tooth into the correct position and the rotations out, the system goes back to being passive again. These wires, this wire is a full-size wire, and this full-size wire has procline, retrocline, neutral brackets on it. Is there any binding or friction here? No. This is a neutral system. It's a passive system once the correction is made. You know, sure, if I took this rubber wire, and this is a full-size 18275 wire, and it was made out of rubber so it could be deflected to mimic copper NiTi, for example. But if I take, a couple of these Ultima brackets and I insert them, and then I deflect these like there's a rotation, you can see where the wire is now got a deflection. If I try to pull these against each other, it's difficult to do, obviously, because there's binding. But that binding is good, because that means that the wire's deflected, it's introducing energy that's going to correct the problem. Once it corrects the problem, then the system goes back to being passive again. And so that's what, you know, this wire exercise shows, is that the system is passive once the rotation is out. So Dr. Damon knew that he needed to build a wire that filled the slot horizontally. These two walls gave you one degree of freedom, but it couldn't be a rectangle. You know, when it was a rectangle, oddly enough, you had the most amount of rotational freedom possible when the torque was correct. Watch what happens to the rotational control when the torque is off. You had better rotation control with flared teeth or retrocline teeth than you did with teeth that were in ideal position. And so that's another thing that's interesting about the Ultima wire, is that that doesn't matter anymore. And so you can separate rotation issues from torque issues very, very cleanly in your mind. So what he did was, I don't know if he yelled combi wire. Did you ever yell combi wire in the middle of the night? I don't know. Probably not. But when he developed this wire, this is what he did. He started with a round wire and then just decided what vertical dimension he wanted the wire to be. That's tied to how much transverse force expression that we would want. He didn't want to pick up an angulation couple. He didn't want to pick up a torque couple, because, you know, when you go through the round wire phase, you're doing your vertical, you're doing your leveling, you're doing all that major tooth movement. And the 14275 is only designed to do two things. It's designed to help facilitate transverse development and finalize rotation and maintain it. So that's how he came up with the round wire in the 14275. So now, when I introduce that wire into that lateral, and we'll slap this on here and say that, you know, it's that same flared lateral. Well, the lateral's still going to be flared, but I know that it's not an in-out problem because I've filled the slot horizontally. And I know what the in-out is between the lateral and the surface of the base of the bracket and the surface of the tooth. Because in-outs is very easy. In-outs is very easy, and it's been standard around this industry forever. You know, the tooth with the smallest in-out is the canine, because it's the most prominent tooth. So it's got the lowest in-out. But then you try to sweep the wire as close to all of the teeth as you can, and then that's what determines what the in-out is. And so I know that I don't have an in-out problem, unless there's some strange morphological tooth discrepancy, which, you know, on occasion can happen. And Dr. Bicknell's going to talk about how he addresses that when the odd time that he sees it. But if the torque is off now on this lateral, if I see what it looks like an in-out problem, I'm going to go, okay, that's not an in-out problem. That's a torque problem, and I'm not going to mess with it, because I know it's going to be fixed with the subsequent wire if we have the correct bracket on. So let's pick the right bracket for that lateral. If the lateral's going to come in flared and we know it, then the correct bracket to choose would be obviously a retrocline bracket. So if I take a retrocline bracket, and if I put the 3 degrees, which is the prescription, and the in-out, because it's not that complicated when you break it down to this level, when you go, you know, the prescription and the in-out plus the bracket plus the wire should equal a tooth position. Those are the 3 things you got to know, and then you got to build the tolerances correctly. But so here we go. We're dragging the lateral. 14 dragged it as far as it could. 18 dragged it a little bit further. It drags it until the wire kind of gets back to its original shape, and it sort of finds its center again, because everything is built around the center of that wire. And then you go, okay, well, let's put in the 14275, knowing that the objective is to take out the rotations. You open the door, you put it in, and then in many cases, you're gonna have to deflect that wire a little bit to get it in. And you'll see a one-to-one relationship between the deflection and the correction. And then you'll know when that patient comes back, it's not gonna be like a surprise, oh, it worked. You're gonna know it worked because basically you inserted the bend that you normally would have probably made, and it was done much more accurately than if it was a manual attempt. But this drags the box a little bit further. And now we go, okay, we're finished with the 14275, rotations are out, arch development, arch form is looking good. The case almost looks like it does coming out of a 1925 wire. Even better, as Dr. Damon showed, because you're filling the slot more earlier, but filling it with copper NiTi and getting all of that expression with wires that offer, you know, in orders of magnitude less force than bent stainless steel. This is a statement that took me a while to get comfortable saying, but because it's just so true, it's easier to say now. But when we understood that, you know, doctors using 1925 wires and 022 slots, standard prescriptions, the teeth could be 12 degrees. What does that look like to you? Does that look like that wrench I showed? That's that same angle as the wrong tool for that job. But when doctors come out of 1925 wires, you know, you never see teeth that are 12 degrees off in either direction. And so this was never torquing throughout the history of the profession. 1925 wires and 022 neutral brackets, and it didn't matter what the prescription was. But so here we are, for the first time in the history of orthodontics, you're going to come out of your 14275 wire, and on average, on run-of-the-mill cases, you know, it's going to be about 5 or 6 months. And those aren't the very, very hard cases that need to stay in round wire for a year. And you know, Dr. Damon will be the first one to tell or yell, don't move through your wires too fast. Let them work. And if the round wire phase takes a long time, then just respect it and just let the biology respond as it should. But on your average case, it could be 5 or 6 months. When you get into the 18275 wire, you're going to go to insert this wire, and that wire isn't going to go in just like you're driving it into the garage. You're going to have to slightly deflect it. And then when you slightly deflect the wire's not happy. Now the wire has pent up energy. It's going to try to express itself around that center point. And then it's going to rotate the bracket and deliver the desired tooth position. So right now, we are looking at what's on our brochure. The first true full expression wire, because I have full rotation control. Because the slot is filled vertically, we have full angulation control. And because we're hitting the torque couples, we have full torque control. If we look now at maybe a central that is retroclined. So I'm going to put on 7 degrees because 7 degrees is what was measured off the table, and when that's kicked up onto the occlusal plane that puts the tooth in the right spot, there can only be one prescription. That was the easiest thing for Dr. Damon when he built the Ultima full expression system. So he says, I said, well, what should the prescription be? And he goes, Andrews. I go, oh, I guess that makes sense. Right? So here, if we if we take the central and then here we go and we're going to drag the box and we'll do it fast. That tooth is yeah, it's in yeah, it needs proclination. We drag the box. We put in the 18, drag the box. We put in the 14,275. Okay, here we are. We've got our rotation control, but our torque is still not done. Tooth is looking a little bit retroclined. We go ahead and we insert the 18,275 wire. Doesn't go right in. We have to twist it. It unloads around this center point, moves the tooth into the ideal position, and then that central is at 7 degrees. Now, there's two words that you might incorporate into the presentations that you do, and we use these terms, Ultima corrects and then protects, because it'll correct the rotation and then it protects you against you losing it. You know, Ultima will correct this torque on this retroclined central, but then it protects you from losing it because we're on a torque couple. And if I'm running class 2 elastics in a vector like this, there's nowhere for this to go. It can't dump. And if you put extreme amount of force on, and maybe it was deflecting the nickel titanium wire because you were just pulling way too hard, this is resisting it, and it's going to want to move it back into the correct position. But that's one consideration that you need to have when you're, you know, applying force against the system. Are you applying so much force that you're overpowering the wire? And if you are, but that's the amount of force that you believe you need to perform, you know, the movement that you want, then what Dr. Damon did was give you the flexibility to increase the stiffness of the wire. So you could have an 18,275 copper NiTi in there, and you could be trying to protect against torque loss, but you know in your mind that that wire might be too soft, and it might bend or deflect actually, and we can lose torque that way, you know, by increasing vertical and extruding teeth, and there's a bunch of things that could be happening there. But so then you could say, you know what, I'm going to take out the 18,275 copper NiTi, and I'm going to put in an 18,275 stainless steel, which is the rigid bar that's going to, you know, help maybe maintain the levelness of the case and then protect against deflection of your mechanics. And when you go to insert that wire, this is what that wire insertion is going to feel like. And the patient won't feel it, because if the 18,275 copper is already expressed, you open the door, you take the steel wire, drive it in, close the door. You're not deflecting it. You're just putting in a stiffer wire. And then you might shape that wire. You might expand it in the posterior to catch up to the lower arch, so that you can, you know, get the functional occlusion and the interdigitation that you want in the posterior. So, you know, I've got about 5 minutes left, and I want to hit on a couple of things that are often concerns, and the concerns are, you know, if I do choose the wrong bracket, you know, what's going to happen? You know, are bad things going to happen? If I take a procline and a retrocline bracket, and then I take this wire, which is the full size 18,275 wire. It's also flexible, okay? And so I'm going to put the retrocline bracket on first. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the tooth into the desired position that we would want the tooth in. Okay, we're good there. Let's just go with that. And then I'm going to say, okay, if this tooth was flared, watch what happens to the wire when I twist the bracket. The wire picks up energy. I'll move this away a little bit so it doesn't hit it. See how the wire has activation? Well, when I let it go, it brings the tooth back whatever's attached to it to the same position. So the retrocline is going to move the tooth back to the correct position. If I put a procline bracket on and I do the same thing, and let's say that the tooth is retroclined, you're going to put in the wire, you're going to have to deflect it to get it in. The wire has energy, and then when the wire expresses itself, it puts the tooth into the correct position. What if I had a retroclined bracket and a retroclined tooth, and I put on a retroclined bracket? So remember this position that I'm holding it at here. It's just touching down here at the bottom. If I put a retroclined bracket on an already retroclined tooth, here's the retroclined bracket going on the already retroclined tooth. What's happened? Nothing. It just turns into a neutral bracket. And so, we often say, if when people are trying to pick brackets and they get nervous and they don't know what to put on, quite often what happens is they go, oh, let's just put on the neutral because, then I don't have to decide, and maybe I'll decide later. But if you're putting on a neutral bracket, just know that you've got a 0% chance of being right, because the neutral bracket can give you that, or it can give you that. Which one do you want? And that's the way orthodontics has been for the last however many years, because that's that same 12 degrees of play. So we would say in sort of a tongue-in-cheek manner, if you don't know which one to put on, a procline or a retrocline, you're better off flipping a coin than putting on a neutral, because you got a 50% chance of being right. Okay, so and picking the torques is something that Dr. Bicknell will talk about. It is not as challenging as people would think. I often say you just got to kind of think about which way the wind is blowing. There's a couple instances where you're going to know that you're going to want a retrocline bracket on a blocked out lateral, and that's a tell. Okay, I know that I need one there. Dr. Damon has only ever put procline brackets on lower canines because he knows that you can't over upright them, and so easy. Procline brackets on all your canines, great. In terms of which way the wind is blowing, that's just really your sagittal mechanic decisions. And I'm going very high level on torque, and Dr. Bicknell will get into idiosyncrasies and different examples, but very high level. If you're doing class 2 mechanics and you want to protect against flaring on the uppers, what are you going to put on? A retrocline. And if you're on their lower anteriors and you want to prevent retroclining on your, what are you going to put on? A procline. Simple. And then class 3, flip it the other way. The only other one that is a little bit interesting, but because when I read everybody's bios here and I saw how many years of experience that all of you have in passive self-ligation, and this is a very experienced group. When you're doing your canines and you kind of are seeing these blocked out canines, and what your mechanics are, that you're going to maybe put in a coil to open some space, then you're going to grab onto it, and then you're going to try to bring it down. And from your experience, you probably know if you think that canine, every time I do this, it seems to dive in, and I seem to kind of land up with one of those. Well, that's where you use your experience and you go, that baby's getting a procline. Or, this one is a little bit blocked out, and every time I try to bring these type of teeth in, they kind of land up a little bit flared. Then that would be your indication, for a retrocline bracket. But that's very high level on that. And I was told that I could have, I'll steal 5 minutes of your lunch if you want me to just do a quick explanation of overdrive wires. Okay, because that's one that we're often asked, and I think it's one that it's more challenging to answer. So I'm going to think about the best way to demonstrate that. So let's do an upper central, and let's do let's say that the upper central was a little bit retroclined. You got into the full size expression wire, and then you corrected that position, but you're still not happy with it. You're still not happy with it, and the question is why? You know, why does that tooth still look retroclined? I mean, I've got the Procline bracket on, I've got the full expression wire, the wire is level, it's done its job, but why does that tooth still look retroclined? And you know, and the tell might be what you're seeing right here. If it's a high angle case, then you're going to probably need, and you always probably would have, tried to do some dental compensation by putting torque in the wire to torque the teeth out, because you weren't going to fix the occlusal plane, or you're just doing a little, you know, finite dental compensation. You know, you maybe would use pre-torque wires, or you'd manually bend the wire to make up for it. Let's say that instead of a 7-degree occlusal plane, let's say you're at 10, and these look 3 degrees retroclined. But if you're going to manually bend that torque in, we've already established that it's pretty much a guess on how much torque you're going to put in with most systems, because you don't know vertical wire dimension, corner radius, vertical slot dimension, so you're kind of guessing. You put in a pre-torqued wire with 20 degrees of anterior torque. What happens is, if you've got a neutral bracket on, that 20-degree wire with the 1925, 022, 1925, you put in the 20-degree wire. If there's 12 degrees before you hit the couple, then how many degrees of activation do you probably have left in the wire? Yeah, so you could have 9 or 10 degrees of activation. You only wanted 3 degrees to change the facial inclination, a term that Dr. Damon has always said, you know, he didn't really like using those wires because you had to catch it when it was coming by. You know, then it's an exercise of, you know, how fast is this patient's biology going to respond? And am I going to land up flaring those teeth before they come back and see me again? Should I see them in 4 weeks, 6 weeks, or 8 weeks? Hard to know. The neat thing about Ultima is it gives you complete control of this anterior dental compensation, I'm kind of calling it. So let's say that, you know, here's the situation where you've got the 18275 in, and you know it's fully expressed, but it's still not in the position that you want it to be in. You want another 3 degrees. You know, how great is it to know that? How great is it to know that you don't have to play the guessing game anymore, because you know that for each wire that you introduce, whether it's a 19, 20, or 21, and probably no one's ever going to use 21s. We built all of the wires because it's difficult for us to go back 2 years later and put in a requisition to build new wires, and then 3 years later it comes out. Meanwhile, so we built all the wires so we could see which ones were the ones people are going to want. We'll eliminate the ones they don't. But you're probably going to use a 19 or a 20. The most you're probably going to want is another 6 degrees. If you only want 3, and you want to get 3 more degrees of torque, now you've made one decision, and your first decision was you want 3 degrees, and then you get to make another decision. You get to decide how stiff do I want the wire to be, how much force would I like it to exert. So you can say, well, I'm going to put in a 19 3-degree wire, and I'm going to put in stainless steel because I think that's what I need to get this job done. And so then you'll take out the 18275. Maybe it was a stainless steel already because you were coordinating arches. You'll put in the 19275, and when I put it in, you can see how that wire is not happy. That wire has 3 degrees of activation in it. You had to twist it to get it in. It's going to rotate around the center point, and then it's going to give you the extra 3 degrees that you wanted. And if you wanted 3 more degrees, you take that wire out, and you put in the 20 or the 2. Yeah, the 2, okay, whatever. I think we get the point. But you put in the 20, and when you put that in, that's not happy either. And then there's 3 more degrees. So think about the reduction in the amount of variability from vertical slot size, horizontal slot size, corner radius, from the precision of the engineering, from the ability to prescribe how many degrees you want in either direction, and pick what force that you want. It's just all of the control is in your hands, and the guesswork is eliminated. So that same thing applies in the opposite direction with retrocline brackets. So when you see the facial inclinations of your teeth, you go, okay, the system was set up on a 7 degree occlusal plane. I get it, but Dr. Damon has given me the wiggle room of up to 9 degrees in either direction, and I get to control the force, which is a wonderful gift. And what you'll find though is that it's not something that you're going to do very often or all the time. You know, it's kind of like that secret spice in your spice rack that you only pull out once in a while. And so you're not having to inventory a whole pile of different wires, but there'll be a couple that you'll use and you'll like for those types of applications. So I'm going to wrap up there after one other one. Here's the last one. I'm sorry. Flipping brackets, that question comes up. The answer is no. You don't flip brackets, and the reason that you don't is because this system, you don't need to flip them. You just put on the right bracket. If I take a retrocline and I take a procline, and if I put the retrocline on, I'm on the couple right there. That's great. Watch this for center point lineup though. If I put the procline on, I'm on the couple. Holy smokes. Both of those brackets look identical, just like Dr. Damon said, and one's a procline and one's a retrocline. Now, if I was to say, oh, I'm just gonna buy retrocline brackets, and if I need to make it into a procline, I'm gonna flip it. That it doesn't work that way. If you were to, let's say, example, take this procline and flip it, when I'm on the couples don't line up. You don't want this and you don't want that. So no flipping brackets. It'll never give you what you're looking for. So this system, in a nutshell, people always thought, oh my gosh, you know, Ultima's it's complicated. The slot's different, the wire's different. I'm nervous of it. The reality of it is that when we look at everything that's been done in the past, people have had to have a bag of tricks to kind of get around all of the issues. And Dr. Damon said something was really important. You know, he said that people have these habits of applying their old compensating behaviors for twin mechanics or for ASL mechanics, and they just got used to doing things over and over again. And when you use Ultima, it's not like you need to learn a bunch of new tricks. There is no tricks. The system, if it's glued on in the right place, it corrects the rotations, the torque, and the angulation. If you pick the right torque, if you don't pick the right torque, change it out. But a lot of the other things that people did in the past, you just eliminate those. You're not picking up new things, you're dumping things that you used to do. And your life just gets simpler. And the person that is going to speak after me today is a person that I just have enormous respect for, Dr. Bicknell, and he was involved in the initial clinical trial. So we selected 10 doctors in North America to be part of a clinical trial that we started in October of 2019. We ran the clinical trial for 2 years before we launched the product. Many companies launch the products much earlier than that. What we wanted to do was make sure that everything that Dr. Damon said, all of the engineering, expressed clinically the way that these often theoretical models applied. And so I've got over 26,000 clinical records collected from those 10 doctors that treated cases over that period. And we watched in real time, they submitted their records every month. They didn't want to see their patients every month, but they wanted to help us have data that came in on a regular basis so we could make critical comparisons and evaluate the efficacy of this system. Dr. Bicknell is, one of the ones that, the data that he collected is unbelievable. He'll show you that. But what he's done, which is just so amazing, is that he runs a very large scale practice in North America. And he's a very systems-oriented person. So through monitoring his cases, every one of his cases, wait till you see the records he takes, wait till you see the evaluations he does on all of his cases. Then what he's done is he's figured out how to standardize processes. So he's basically going to hand you, experience on over 2,000 cases where he's refined and standardized how to use Ultima to its fullest advantage. So I'm so excited for me to be here with Dr. Damon and Dr. Bicknell, and to have our president in the back of the room, Veronica. It means the world to me. This is a very special time in this profession, and I'm just so happy to be part of it. And I'll keep these things available for the rest of the day, and on breaks or after the sessions or towards the end of lunch. I welcome anybody to come up and we can interact and play with some of these things, and if there's unresolved questions, we'll just go ahead and do that. But I think now might be a great time for everyone to go for lunch. How's that be? Thank you.
Awesome stuff, Steve. It's so smooth with that presentation. We've seen it a few times, Grey Sky, and it simplifies the message. So, thank you so much for making the effort traveling down here to California. Yeah, well done. Really appreciate it. Thanks for your help.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We will break for lunch. Lunch will be served